This part will be for members only. Did you see the Gwyneth Paltrow ad?
I didn't.
Leah, Israel.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. We've been told that opposition to Israel's genocide in Gaza is fringe, extremist, or somehow disconnected from reality. We've been told that the world stands with Israel, that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, and that support for Palestinian freedom is politically toxic. But something remarkable has happened. Public opinion has shifted dramatically, not just across the global south, where support for Palestine has long been strong, but across Europe and North America. Poll after poll shows growing sympathy for Palestinians, growing disgust with Israel's conduct, and growing frustration with political leaders who continue to arm and defend a state that's carrying out mass extermination in Gaza while expanding its wars across the region. That's why Israel's defenders are desperate, struggling to maintain the narratives that justified their genocide in the first place. Evidence continues to mount documenting horrific abuses against Palestinians, including systematic sexual violence. While many of the claims, the libels used to manufacture consent for genocide, have collapsed under scrutiny. What's clear is that no amount of propaganda can overcome what people can see with their own eyes. Not even Gwyneth Paltrow, selling $10 million luxury apartments in a genocidal state, can fix Israel's image problem. Joining me to discuss all of this and more is journalist, author, and director of the Electronic Intifada, Ali Abunimah. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at our website, which just got a fantastic new makeover. Just go to breakthroughnews.org/subscribe. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button here on YouTube and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And smash that like button and share this episode. It helps boost us in the algorithm that hates us. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Ali, welcome back to Dispatches. It's been too long. There's so much to get through. I don't even know where to start, but I'm so happy to have you.
Thank you, Rania. It's been too long. Definitely been too long.
Well,
But you're doing great work.
Well, thank you. So are you. And I also want to note, I think the last time I had you on was like at the very beginning of the Iran war. So
Which one?
That's a good question. The one at the end of February. That one. But there's a lot even that's happened since then. It's just every day too much happens. But there's a lot to get through. And I want to start with a recent article you wrote because first of all, I love the title. The title is Trump Was Right. Everybody Hates Israel. Very straightforward, very accurate. And of course, that's referring to apparently what we're told Trump said to Netanyahu. I don't even remember if it was earlier
He
this
didn't
week
deny
or
it.
last week. Yeah, no, he didn't, but apparently told him everybody hates you. It was after he struck Beirut, I think. And all that's to say, this you delve into the latest numbers on people's feelings for Israel, and basically it shows that global support for Israel is totally collapsing, and it's really significant, because for decades, like Israel's defenders insisted criticism of Israel was confined to these marginal activists and sort of small segments of the left, even though they spent a lot of money to attack those people. But now we're seeing this dramatic expansion of hatred for Israel in public opinion, this kind of growing international isolation, and even really establishment figures acknowledging that these attitudes towards Israel have changed in ways that would have seemed unimaginable just a few years ago. So I guess maybe let's start with what is driving this shift? Is it a temporary reaction to Gaza, or do you think it's something deeper, generational realignment, a kind of realignment that Israel maybe can't recover from?
Let me start by answering what isn't driving this shift. Because when you read Israeli media and listen to Israeli officials, what they think is driving this shift is, of course, anti-Semitism. That's their claim. And the other thing is they think they're not doing a good enough job with propaganda. And so their solution is it's always the same, and it's the same now. More repression against so-called anti-Semitism, which means criticism of Israel, and spend more money on propaganda, buy more influencers, bring more delegations to come and see how wonderful Israel is. And none of that is working for them, because what is really driving this is the genocide. The genocide in Gaza is at the core of this. But of course, the genocide in Gaza, that should be enough. But what the genocide is doing is opening people's eyes and ears to everything else Israel does. So the genocide in Gaza had that effect, this massive shift in global opinion against Israel. You said I wrote about it, and what I was writing about was this new survey in 36 countries by the Pew Research Center. And the decline has been massive since 2022, which of course is the period that coincides with the genocide. But through the lens of the genocide, people now see what Israel is doing in Lebanon. They see Israel's aggression against Iran. They see everything now through the lens of Gaza. So that means that I do think it is irreversible. I don't think the support for Israel can be put back to where it was. And this is worldwide, and also particularly in the imperial core, in the United States and Europe. There are historic shifts taking place.
Yeah, and the numbers are quite striking, because, like you mentioned, across 36 countries, right? And the survey showed that a median of 67% of adults have an unfavorable view of Israel, while 25% have a favorable view. And that's pretty striking. And of course, depending on which country, that shoots up even higher. And you note that the highest negative views of Israel is actually Turkey, 97%, and followed by Pakistan, 95%. But it's not just countries like that, where people would just be like, oh, that's the other side of the world, we don't care about it. It's actually, I was struck by Germany, I think, the most, because I think Germany, I would expect to have the worst numbers. 73% of Germans view Israel unfavorably. That's pretty nuts. 73%. Yeah.
And the other thing that's noticeable, in polls like this, typically you see that there's sort of a large group in the middle, but you're not seeing that here. This is a completely polarized issue. So take Germany, for example. It's not that 73% view Israel unfavorably, yes, but it's not as if then there's like all these people who are on the fence. You then have 23% who view Israel unfavorably. So do the math. You've got 73 plus 23, that's 96. So you've only got 4%
well,
of people.
Sorry, you mean, so wait, so it's 23% view it favorably.
Yes.
Yeah.
And 73 unfavorably. So I'm saying if you add those together, you get 96%, which leaves 4% who are, I don't know, on the fence or who don't know. So you're seeing this extreme polarization. There are not a lot of people who who are unsure what's going on, is what I'm saying. You have a hardcore that is very small, a hardcore minority that is probably going to stick with Israel. Yeah. And then you have a vast majority that has very negative views of Israel. So as you said, Germany, Germany 73%, Sweden 78%, Spain 78%. But even other countries with very pro-Israel governments, of course, Germany is one of the most pro-Israel, but Hungary, 54% of the population, Greece, 65%, and so on and so on. And even in the countries where there is, like Argentina, for example, where you have this fanatically pro-Israel president now, Javier Milei, in the past year, Israel's position has dramatically deteriorated. So having a pro-Israel government talking about how great Israel is all the time actually seems to be turning the local populations off. So in Argentina, in last year's survey, 46%, less than half of people had a negative view of Israel. This year, it's a 55% majority. So Javier Milei, for whatever reason they voted for him, is not helping Israel. And so it is all around the world.
And then we get to the US, and in the US, you've got 60% of Americans holding negative views of Israel. That's up from 53% last year. That's a big difference. And then
it's also historic because last year, or the last year or 2 years, I'd have to go back and check, but it's only during the genocide that polls consistently started showing a majority of Americans with unfavorable views of Israel. That is the historic shift that happened during and because of the genocide. And what the Pew surveys show is that trend is consolidating and accelerating. So you have a further slide in Israel's position from last year, and you see the polarization in various subgroups. So among Democrats, it's far higher. The anti-Israel or negative sentiment towards Israel is far higher among Democrats than among Republicans. Among Democrats, I think it's 83%, according to Pew. Among Republicans, it's 37%. So you think that's a big polarization. In fact, in the US, that's the largest gap. In other countries, the left-right gap is much narrower. But something very interesting happens when you look at younger Americans, because they define younger Americans as people
18 to 49.
18 to 49.
I fall into the group of younger Americans. Thank you very much.
I'm going to say I do. I'm an honorary member. At least I was for most of my life. But there, of course, overall, Israel is viewed very negatively. But there, the political polarization is also much less. You've got I think it's, I'm just looking it up.
84%. So it's 84% for Democrats, 18 to 49, 57% for Republicans,
correct.
18 for 49.
So 57% among Republicans under 49. That's huge.
Unfavorable Israel, they view
unfavorable. And what will it be next year? So these are really historic shifts going on, and nothing Israel is throwing at this, nothing the lobby is throwing at this, is turning this Titanic around as it heads towards the proverbial iceberg.
So there's like a multi-pronged effort, obviously, to try to contain this. And some of those efforts include the sort of same propaganda we've already seen, just in overdrive. And then another aspect of those efforts include just blatant repression, because at some point there's an understanding that, okay, we can't change public opinion. So now we have to actually join forces and use like the state apparatus to repress this sentiment that we can't change. So I want to kind of split those two things up. So I want to first talk about this kind of elite panic and what they're doing about it in terms of the propagandistic element. And I think that we see that being done more in a way to try to contain the Democratic shift, I would say, because on the Republican side, it's just brute force for everything. So something comes to mind, which I saw recently this week, which was this Axios article talking about Jewish Democrats warning that they're being pushed out of the Democratic Party because opposition to Israel has become so widespread, and that's basically just anti-Semitism. And it was just completely absurd and ridiculous. But and then of course it's going after these progressive people who are doing the Democratic primary challenges, who the issue of Palestine has become so mainstream and so important. And obviously 83% unfavorable view of Israel on the Democratic side, it's becoming almost like a litmus test to demonstrate that you are not bought and paid for. So like if you can demonstrate you're not bought and paid for on Israel-Palestine, then you can demonstrate that you're not going to be bought and paid for on like Medicare for all or all of these other very important issues that don't even have anything to do with Palestine, right? I feel like it's becoming a litmus test in that way. And so you have these insane attacks on people who are challenging these sort of centrist pro-Israel Democrats. So I kind of wanted to ask you about that because we've talked about, I think you and I, Ali, have talked for like the last decade about the shifting views of Palestine inside the Democratic Party. It's been, you know, something that's been sort of polarizing the party for years, and I don't think it's ever been as relevant as what we're seeing take place now. So why is there such a massive disconnect between Democratic voters and these Democratic elites on this issue? And how sustainable is that gap politically? Because they've managed to function as a party with that gap for a while now, but I feel like it's kind of breaking.
Why is there such a wide gap? Because these are not the same people. You know, you're talking about the Democratic Party elite and donors are the billionaire class, the Epstein class, the hedge fund class, the coastal elites, all these terms that capture to a greater or lesser extent who runs the party. You know, the people who think Rahm Emanuel would be a great candidate, who thought Kamala Harris or Joe Biden would be great standard bearers for the party. The reason they've gotten away with it for so long, and I think they may still get away with it for a while, despite the fact that the position is eroding, is because a lot of people, including many reasonable people, will say, we just have to get Donald Trump and the Republicans out, which is, of course, what the Democrats have always relied on. And this is a lot like a lot of authoritarian regimes and dictatorships around the world. I'm not going to specify, but there's many of them where the secret to their success is not that they are in any way good or loved by their people. It's that they've managed to eliminate any alternative. And that's what the Democrats are very good at. They're very good at absorbing, co-opting, undermining any viable challenge from the left and leaving people with the stark choice of, well, who are you going to vote for? A genocide Joe Biden or Donald Trump? And that gamble did fail in 2024. You know, apparently we've heard it reported that the Democrats had this big autopsy or post-mortem after the election. 200
pages.
Yeah, I think it eventually came out. I didn't bother to read it, but didn't mention Gaza. But a lot of good analysis shows that Gaza had an effect and that a lot of people just made a moral decision that you cannot lesser evil genocide. Genocide is genocide. And you can say to us, well, Donald Trump is going to be worse. We know that. We've seen worse. We don't care. We're staying home. You know, and that, I think, is what I think it played a major part in losing them the election. You don't actually need to lose that many votes, although it may have been a lot of votes that they lost because of this. But whatever election is coming up, the midterms or then the presidential election in 2028, I guess it will be, people will have had several more years of Donald Trump's insanity, cruelty, starting wars, whatever it is, and they may just accept any warm body that the Democrats put up. So that does delay the reckoning. But the fights are happening in these local races. What happened with Zohran Mamdani, his victory, is very significant. And that's aside from how people evaluate Zohran Mamdani as a person or as, someone whose opinions you love or hate. The point is that they pulled out all the stops to defeat him. And a majority, narrow majority, but an absolute majority of New Yorkers voted for him and said, no, this is who we want. And we don't care that he called Israel, he said Israel is committing genocide. In fact, that's why we want him.
Yeah.
That's why we want him. So that is significant. I think where that goes, the Democratic leadership and the US elites in general are defying political gravity on this issue.
I love that. They really are defying gravity from just like the movie Wicked. Great song. I want to ask though, like about the authoritarian response, because I think that's a really dangerous element to all of this, because, the Israelis like to frame it as it's just like a bunch of fringe kooky people who hate us. But obviously, if it was such a fringe movement, you would not have the governments of many powerful countries reacting the way that they are, with extreme repression, with a level of remarkable escalation against this really tsunami of a shift on the issue of Palestine. And in the US, that includes things like legal residents and students having been detained, threatened with deportation because of their activism against genocide in Palestine. Professors and teachers have been fired, they've been suspended, or just like investigated for speaking out. We have this anti-BDS legislation, which continues to spread. All of this, of course, has been covered regularly at the Electronic Intifada. In a place like the UK, you have the government moving to criminalize Palestine action and actually charging people involved with terrorism. In Germany, the authorities have literally banned the phrase "from the river to the sea." And that's in addition to a lot of other horrible things they've done to target Palestine solidarity activists. And I could go on and on and on. But what's striking is that these measures are intensifying, obviously, because of the public opinion shifting against Israel. And then you hear what leadership of various pro-Israel organizations are saying. Let's take the ADL, for example. You'll hear Jonathan Greenblatt bragging about the role his organization is playing and basically like making lists of people for the U.S. government to go after based on their anti-Semitism. But when he says anti-Semitism, he just means pro-Palestine activism against, Israeli genocide. So I guess I'm curious, like this, I think this is really dangerous. And I think people need to understand just how dangerous all of this is, because it's like ratcheting up the repression in these countries to basically shut down public opinion. It's moving us into an even more anti-democratic direction. And so anyways, I'm curious your thoughts on all of that. I know I threw just a bunch of things out there just now.
You're exactly right. If public opinion supported these governments and their complicity with and support for the genocide, then none of this repression would be necessary. So they have been escalating the repression for years. It's ramped up significantly during the genocide, and it hasn't worked. It has not stopped the slide in Israel's popularity and the growing support for Palestine solidarity. I think it's had the opposite effect of actually further discrediting Western liberal institutions and governments, because it is a litmus test. You can't go around the world proclaiming we support democracy and human rights and apple pie, and when it comes to genocide and how brave Ukrainians are for resisting Russia and how brave Iranians are for protesting their government, and then when it comes to genocide, say, yeah, that's fine. We're gonna support Israel in destroying a people just because they want to be free on their own land. They want to be free from apartheid. So it's discrediting them even further. And I think accelerating the bigger institutional and legitimacy crisis that Western regimes have, because their big selling point, you and I were talking just before the show about how when you go through big cities in the United States, you see homeless people everywhere. You go to any big downtown and people are sleeping in doorways. There are tents in the parks in Chicago, tent cities or tent villages anyway, all over the place of people who can't afford a home, or who can't get health services, who can't get addiction treatment, who can't get all the basic needs filled in any society. That's been the case for decades in the West, where neoliberalism says basically you're on your own. But the last selling point of the West, the last big slogan they had is, well, we have freedom, we have democracy, we
Right.
have free speech. So, but they're taking that away too. So what is left is just rapacious capitalism and dog eat dog. And if you're lucky to be to inherit wealth or to go to an elite school and get into some of these elite businesses, you'll be okay. But vast numbers of people have nothing and have less and less, let's say. So I'm saying that because I think the repression focused on Palestine solidarity further delegitimizes this already fraying system.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, all of the methods of repression they use against Palestine solidarity just end up getting used against protests for other things as well, whether it's against, ICE rounding people up and deporting them, or against economic policies that are just getting more extreme and insane because capitalism is so, as you called it, rapacious. I want to move on to another issue here, which, I mean, all of this stuff is very serious that we're talking about, but I think this is probably the most disturbing, one of the most disturbing aspects, if we had to put it on a hierarchy of what we've seen over the past couple of years. And that is the issue of sexual violence. And maybe let's start with, one of the most common pieces, one of the most common talking points that you hear from Israel's supporters is that, these sensational allegations made about October 7th, about Hamas carrying out mass rape against Israeli women. And even though there's been no evidence presented to back this up, in fact, any evidence that has been presented, which has just been, hearsay, has completely collapsed, has fallen apart, has been exposed as untrue, and just basically smears and blood libel style lies, but that's still repeated pretty regularly, I would say, by pro-Israel politicians in the U.S. and by pro-Israel figures in the media. There's also, then ironically, it's actually the Israelis who are carrying out mass rape on a unprecedented level. They basically have created this network of rape dungeons. They're using dogs to carry out acts of rapes. I mean, it's just horrific. And I want to get into both of those sides. So first, because Electronic Intifada has done really groundbreaking reporting on both the false Israeli narrative about sexual violence and about the ignored actual sexual violence taking place against Israel's victims and targets. So can you talk a bit about the allegations of sexual violence that were used politically after October 7th, specifically about more recent evidence that has, maybe not evidence, but more recent, actually, yeah, evidence that has basically made this narrative fall apart even more?
Yeah. What do they say? Every accusation is a confession. And that is so true about this Israeli claim of mass rape on October 7th. And that claim emerged very soon after October 7th. And it's a narrative that they've pushed very hard. And the New York Times played a big role in pushing this narrative with its notorious article, Screams Without Words. Sheryl Sandberg, former Facebook executive and billionaire, did this film called Screams Before Silence that pushed this narrative. And there have been countless reports. And as you say, countless statements from government officials, including the Biden administration, Kamala Harris. She screened the Sandberg film at the White House. When we were talking about the sort of propaganda efforts to win back support for Israel, one thing I wanted to say is that because there is no grassroots support for Israel, they have to trot out elite figures who are already in themselves extremely hated by the population to try to win back support for Israel. And so, particularly in the case of the mass rape claim, who did they bring out time and again? Hillary Clinton. Everyone loves Hillary Clinton, right?
That's why she keeps winning presidential elections.
Yeah, exactly. She's such a winner. But she became one of the main spokespeople for this mass rape narrative on October 7th. Well, we have been reporting on this at the Electronic Intifada in depth and in detail and with showing all our work. You can, everything is there, chapter and verse. How we come to the conclusions we come to is all there. People can find it. If you just Google mass rape accusation Electronic Intifada, it will take you to a link that has all our reporting from beginning to end. So in sum, there is not, to this day, we're now in June 2026, so we're talking now nearly 3 years after October 7th, there is not one single credible, documented, verified case of rape from October 7th. Not one person living or dead. And you can find, and people will tweet this at you who say, but what about these broad, vague, general statements even from UN reports, which we've also examined in detail. But you go into those UN reports, which are hundreds of pages long, and they cannot point to a single verified case. And I'll give you an example. Just in the last couple of weeks, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued an annual report to the Security Council that he's mandated to give to the Security Council on sexual violence and armed conflict. And the report, it's got his signature on it, but the person who's actually in charge of preparing it is a woman called Pramila Patten, who is his special representative on sexual violence in armed conflict. And Pramila Patten had previously done a big report in March 2024 where she went to Israel and so on. And that report was used to push the narrative, even though when you actually read it, they can't verify any case of rape. But the Secretary General's report is very important because it doesn't just deal with Israel, it deals with the whole world. So they look at Israel, they look at Palestinians, Palestine, and they look at other conflicts. And that report says the UN, and we're talking about specialized UN bodies, including the Human Rights Office and other agencies that have this expertise, they verified 31 cases of rape against Palestinians by Israeli forces. And if it's okay, Rania, and it won't be too explicit, but it will be quite graphic.
No, but this is real. People need to know what's happening. So say what you need to say.
So I want to tell you what the UN report says the UN specialized agencies verified. And verified is the highest standard. It means that they have what they consider to be incontrovertible evidence to support these claims. So they verified conflict-related sexual violence, including rape and torture by Israeli forces against 31 Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank. 14 men, 7 women, 9 boys, and 1 girl. The crimes include rape, rape with objects, gang rape, attempted rape, forced nudity, threats of rape, unwanted touching of breasts and genitals, genital violence, targeted shooting of the genitals, and strip and cavity searches without security justification. Rape and gang rape, sometimes repeated, were verified against 9 victims, most of them from Gaza. The perpetrators identified by the UN include the Israeli army, the Israel Prison Service, and Yamam, the police counterterrorism unit. The places where these abuses took place, mainly during interrogation and detention, were at prisons and detention sites including Sede Teman, Etzion, Megiddo, Ofer, Ramle, Hasharon, and Gush Etzion. The victims included journalists and human rights defenders. Some of the violations were filmed or photographed, including 1 rape. Men and boys were subjected to rape, attempted rape, and genital violence. 5 male victims suffered severe rectal bleeding or swelling for days or weeks, in some cases without medical treatment. Now, an important point, the UN says that they have many, many more credible accounts of similar crimes, but that they haven't been able to verify them yet. So these are the ones that they have verified to the highest standard. We have other human rights organizations like Euromed that have documented many, many more than these 31 crimes. But just take these 31. Let's take that as the minimum that is verified. On the side of Israel, this same UN report from the Secretary General to the Security Council cannot speak of a single verified case of a rape or even any kind of sexual violence against an Israeli from or after October 7th. This includes Israeli captives who are released from Gaza, some of whom, 6 of whom, according to the UN report, made allegations of sexual violence, not specifically rape, not rape, in fact, sexual violence of other kinds while in captivity. But the UN report says the UN was unable to verify any of these claims. So this is what we're dealing with. But when you just compare the coverage that Israel's lies and fabrications and atrocity propaganda have gotten and continue to get with the near silence about Israel's documented, verified crimes against Palestinians.
And it's interesting because the Israelis aren't silent about it. They're proud of it.
Very.
They're bragging about it because this isn't like a one-off where there's a couple like perverts who are violent criminals inside the Israeli military, though that's absolutely clearly true. This is systematic. This is an order coming from the top. This is a decision to use sexual violence to punish and break people.
That's what the evidence shows. That's what the Euromed report, which is another major investigation that came out in March, and which we reported on. I wrote about at the Electronic Intifada, and we interviewed Meha Husseini, one of the people who wrote that report, on the Electronic Intifada live stream. People can find that on the Electronic Intifada YouTube channel. We spent I think 45 minutes in that interview going through the findings with Meha Husseini. And it's clear that this is systematic. It is, if not directly ordered, they probably don't put it in writing. It is known and condoned, and not only is no effort made to stop it, but there are efforts to protect those who are carrying out or supervising these crimes.
Yeah, and then that's why, you hear that, and then you understand why the Israelis are spending $730 million in their 2026 budget on propaganda. Because despite the fact that Dana Bash has shown no interest in reporting on this sexual violence while she promoted lies about Palestinians on October 7th, despite the fact that CNN doesn't cover this and the New York Times, like, it'll get buried in like an 8,000 word piece and not a headline. Once. That's it, just once.
Yeah, until Nick Kristoff's column a couple of weeks ago.
Opinion column, because
on the opinion
it's an
page.
Opinion, yeah. But aside from that, you're just people still are hearing about this and are seeing this, especially that young group of people between the ages of 18 to 49, which I fall into.
But it's not working. I mean, that's the point, is they have invested so much in this specific narrative, and it's not working.
It's disgusting. And then it just makes these like vacuous robots like Richie Torres and Debbie Wasserman Schultz, and they're just the several other versions of them that exist to represent every awful interest you can think of, because they are bought. It just makes them even more hated, because
what's so cynical about it is that it's not, well, it taps into really crude racist colonial stereotypes of the sex-obsessed, animal-like native who, lusts for the settler woman, the Western woman, the civilized woman. There's that part of it, but the other part of it is it's trying to exploit progressive and left-wing or liberal sensitivities about women's rights and sexual violence, and to shame people who don't buy into this narrative, if you don't buy into the Israeli rape claims, it means you're a rape apologist. It means you don't care about women's rights. It's trying to Me Too genocide.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good way to put it. Meanwhile, this army of rapists is currently invading Lebanon for the seventh time. And that's my segue to ask you to address the issue of Lebanon, because I know that, I know that you follow Lebanon closely and you see what the Lebanese government that is in bed with the Israelis and Americans is doing right now, essentially turning on their own people and joining the Israeli war on Lebanon against Hezbollah and against really any resistance to the Israelis. It's quite embarrassing and pathetic to watch. And I think the idea by the Americans and the Israelis here seems to be to basically recruit Lebanese state institutions, including the Lebanese army, to help suppress resistance movements in Lebanon and to basically manage Israel's security interests in Lebanon for it. And this is something that we've seen before. We've seen it happen in Palestine with regard to the way that the Palestinian Authority has become this sort of arm of the Israeli occupation, where they police Palestinians in the West Bank for the Israelis. So I'm curious if you can maybe talk about why this strategy is so dangerous. I mean, I don't think it'll work in Lebanon because Lebanon is just a different situation altogether. But it's still incredibly dangerous, and why it's important for people to recognize what's happening before it becomes normalized.
Yeah, I think you said it. It's exactly an effort to replicate in Lebanon what the approach has been in Palestine, where you have a collaborationist leadership, the so-called Palestinian Authority, which, it started with the co-optation of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, through the Oslo Accords. And a few years earlier, it was a process, and eventually transforming it into the Palestinian Authority, a collaborationist so-called leadership whose so-called security forces serve the occupier and whose goal is to repress Palestinian resistance to the occupier. That's why the European Union, and I don't think the US still funds them, but they did for many years, but they now do it through their European proxies. Just earlier on, I was tweeting about EU training for so-called Palestinian security forces. And the only reason, Germany would pay to train Palestinian security forces is that these are anti-Palestinian security forces, anti-resistance security forces. And this is exactly the approach in Lebanon. Has it worked in Palestine? Well, it has bought Israel and its Western sponsors some time and some space in places. It hasn't certainly didn't succeed in repressing resistance in Gaza. In the West Bank, it's been more successful during periods, but then resistance reemerges. But it won't work in the end, because it won't work in Palestine, it won't work in Lebanon, because you have to put yourself in the position of Lebanese people who support the fundamental right to self-defense and resistance. And what would it take for people who have already given so much in defense of their homeland, whether it's fighters themselves or whether it's their families, their mothers, their fathers, their siblings, their communities who have made these extraordinary sacrifices to defend their land and stay on their land, are they going to say, oh, okay, we just give up? People don't do that. They don't just give up. And why would they give up when they're winning? And that's the other thing, is Lebanon is not a lost cause, nor is Palestine, by the way. That I don't want to imply that it is. But Lebanon is not a lost cause. The resistance in Lebanon is beating Israel. We see it every week on the Electronic Intifada live stream with the analysis that my colleague John Elmer does of the FPV drones. Of course, everyone's looking at that, but we
are these drones? Wait, so are these are good drones or bad drones? Because the ones in Ukraine are good drones.
Great drones, yeah, plucky drones that plucky.
Drones.
sort of self-taught engineers are putting together
It's
from bits and
amazing,
pieces,
actually. Yeah.
sticks and bits of thread and ribbon that they're finding in their grandmother's closet, and they're taking on the big bad Russians. But when it's Hezbollah, it's evil, scary drones.
Yes.
Even though this is, to a great extent, Hezbollah's own engineering.
Yeah, they don't have a bajillion dollars coming from the West.
No. So these are one. What's the saying? One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. That old saying. Well,
yeah.
It applies to drones too, apparently. So Israel isn't winning in Lebanon. Hezbollah is defending the territory. Does anyone think that if Hezbollah wasn't there fighting, that Israel would not have occupied Lebanon up to
Actually,
and
the
perhaps
sad
beyond
thing
Beirut?
is, there are people who make that argument. And I'm like, you guys, 1982, they literally waltzed into Beirut.
Yeah.
Because there was no Hezbollah or anyone.
And now they're not, they're committing horrific massacres. They are committing absolutely horrific massacres. There's no question about that. But they would be doing much worse if there was no resistance. If there was no resistance, there would be, the deluded Lebanese.
We'd be speaking Hebrew.
Well, you wouldn't be. I don't even think that's what it would be. I don't think that's what it would be. I think more realistically, it would be this. There are the deluded people who think, if it wasn't for Hezbollah, if it wasn't for Iran, Lebanon would be all, rainbows and unicorns. Actually, if there was no resistance, Lebanon might not exist, or it would be much smaller, and there would be tens of thousands of Israeli settlers with settlements with those red roof tiles all the way up to the Litani River or beyond. Yes. That's what it would be. Just as there are settlements on the Golan Heights and settlements across the West Bank. There's no settlements in Gaza. They've talked about bringing settlements back for the past 3 years. They haven't, and they can't, because the resistance is still there. And it's not people say, what is this resistance that ended up with, hundreds of thousands dead in Gaza and Gaza ruined? The resistance didn't do that. Israel did that.
Yes.
The United States did that. The European Union did that. The resistance didn't do that. Palestinians are not responsible for Israel's crimes. Hezbollah is not responsible for Israel's barbarity and savagery. Iran is not responsible for the murderous savagery of Israel. Iran didn't do that. It stood by people in Lebanon.
Yeah.
And the colonized mind and the traitorous mind of the Lebanese so-called leadership is such that when a powerful country comes to your aid, you say, no, we don't want it. We prefer to surrender.
It's wild.
This is a sickness. It's a sickness.
And I don't know, it absolutely is. And it's so utterly shocking. Like, Iran stepped up and literally bombed Israel because Beirut got bombed. And I think it was like the next day, the Lebanese prime minister, who was a judge at the International Criminal Court of Justice on the issue of genocide in Gaza, sat there and basically said, stay out of our affairs. But so you trust Marco Rubio? Like, you want to side with Marco Rubio, who is literally arming the people who are doing to Lebanon what was done to Gaza and are saying they'll do more. It's utterly insane and absolutely treacherous. You are so right. And I think you just gave a really good explanation, too, of the fact that submission doesn't even work. Submission does not work because... Has
it worked in the West Bank? Did submission work in the West Bank?
I see more and more villages getting eliminated. Has submission worked? Also, has submission look at Syria after Ahmed al-Sharaa, Mohammed al-Jalani, whatever the hell you want to call him, after he came to power, the first thing Israel did was destroy all of Syria's military capabilities. And since then, Syria has not fired a single shot at the Israelis, yet they've continued to put money into settlement expansion in the Golan. They have continued to do raids into Syria and have literally kidnapped people, and they bomb Syria whenever they please. So this leader is begging them to be his friend. No, submission does not get you anywhere. And You see the Israelis saying after Iran, what's next? After Iran, it's Turkey and then maybe Saudi Arabia. Because at the end of the day, they don't want, and this is another aspect that I wanted to ask you about. It's this issue of Greater Israel, because I think obviously Greater Israel is about, expanding borders, and the Greater Israel Project has an idea of borders that encompass a lot more territory than they have control over right now. And that includes parts of Lebanon, parts of Syria, part of Jordan, parts of Iraq, I think. And on. According to Mike Huckabee, we should just give it all to them.
Nile, from the Nile to the Euphrates.
Yes. Are we allowed to say that in Germany still? From the Nile to the Euphrates? Is that one body of water to another?
From the river to the river. Yeah. You're allowed to say from the river to the river in Germany, not the river to the sea.
Yes. But I think Greater Israel also means keeping every single country in the region unstable and weak, so that it can never pose not just a military threat even to Israel, but even like an economic challenge to Israel. And that's something that everybody, I think, needs to understand. And I mean, everybody maybe but the Emirates is beginning to understand that. I don't know what is wrong with the people who are running the Emirates a lot, but they seem to have no understanding that Israel is actually like a downside to everybody who cares about any sense of stability. There's a few other things I want to touch on here while I have you. And they're fun topics. They're fun topics because there's a lot of debate around them. And I have my positions on these. I know you do too. So I want to get your take. And the one I want to start with is who's really in charge, because I think it's very, very popular right now. It's become increasingly popular to say that the Israelis are in charge of the Americans, and that, like America first. You can't be America first and Israel first, because Israel first means like basically like screwing over America. And I get the argument. I just think that it's like, I think that in the broader scheme of things, like, yes, there is nuances here, that there is an Israel lobby. There are different factions in the American ruling class that align with the Likud side of Israel more than maybe others. And Netanyahu is a great manipulator. And it does, based on reporting, sound like Netanyahu played a huge role in convincing Trump to go into this ridiculous, disastrous war against Iran that they can't win, right? I'm not doubting that. I'm not doubting that the Israel lobby has a huge amount of influence over our politicians and kind of policing them and putting them in line. However, at the end of the day, it still is in service of American imperialism as I see it. And I feel like if people miss that detail, they miss the fact that, like, it's not just Iran the U.S. is attacking. It's also attacking Cuba. It's also attacking Venezuela. It also has a desire to attack China at some point. And that's all of part of the same reason why the U.S. does, in fact, want to attack Iran. Not just because Netanyahu came and persuaded Trump. Maybe he persuaded Trump to do it very stupidly, but the U.S. has had a longstanding desire for U.S. reasons and U.S. interests to destroy Iran as a country, or as like a revolutionary country, and put it back into like the camp of a controlled client state. And so I still believe very much that it's America in charge, and that the Israel lobby functions in a similar way that like the pharmaceutical industry functions, or any other major lobby functions, the weapon industry lobby functions. They're not the reason we go to war, but they create extra reasons and also police politicians that might get in the way of that. That's my take. I wanted to hear your take, because I love the way you explain things, and I know this is a very prevalent talking point these days.
The first thing I'll say is I agree with you. I see things pretty much the way you just laid them out. But remember what Joe Biden said. He said famously more than once that if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it.
Yes, we have to invent an Israel.
It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
Yes. And you said that Israel is in the service of U.S. empire. It is, but it's more than that. Israel's existence depends on U.S. empire. Without the United States, Israel would cease to exist.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, become a Breakthrough News member at breakthroughnews.org/subscribe.